Thank you so much. I want to thank Mariella and Ariel for organizing this tremendous event, and I'm honored and humbled to be here. I have a feeling like I've stepped into a revolutionary cauldron here in Israel, and I expect great things to happen of this. What I want to do today is give you a few brief touch points in, it's frightening, 40 years of my experience in this process. And basically what I want to do is explain what has led me forwards and where I have repeatedly asked myself, is what I'm doing, what I'm advocating, supported by the data? And I think we should all do this, and I think Gary pointed this out at the start, that science really has to question its hypotheses rather than trying to prove its hypotheses. And I hope I've done the questioning part well over the course of my career. I do have conflicts of interest. I am author of a number of books from which I receive royalties. I try to advise the Atkins Nutritional Company on the composition of their products, and I keep telling them put more fat in it, and they don't want to do it because they think it's hard to sell fat. Anyway, but I keep trying. And I'm a founder of Virta Health Corporation. Anything I say about that, you have to question it because I'm heavily conflicted financially with this entity. But anything and everything I show you today and tomorrow will come from peer-reviewed published research in that regard. I wish I could have sat down and spoken with these two women in their language back in 1910 when this photograph was taken, because it would have saved me a whole lot of time going back and trying to figure out what they knew, but they didn't write it down. These are women from the modern Inuit who had lived in the Arctic for 1,800 years, and they had distilled clearly knowledge from into their culture, from their experience to deal with the question of when you live in the Arctic where there's almost no vegetable matter that's edible, how do you live on a diet that is predominantly composed of fat and meat? How do you choose between what you save and feed your family and what you feed the dogs? And they were constantly having to divide the results of their hunt between what they fed their family and what they fed their dogs. And by the way, this is a group of people who were dependent on dogs. Their civilization was built around their symbiotic relationship with the dogs. But like I said, they didn't write it down. There were Europeans who lived among the Inuit. Many Europeans went and lived among the Inuit and tried to convert them to our culture and our religion. There were some who went among them and tried to learn what they knew. And some of the Europeans used their knowledge to perform remarkable feats of physical performance. And this is a pastel diagram that I'm sorry.
Can you hear it now?
Yeah. Anyway, what this demonstrates here is a group of Europeans with a group of Inuit, and you notice they're writing down information. This was from the diary of an Arctic explorer named Frederick Swatka, and he wanted to go into the Arctic and find out what happened to a Royal Navy expedition that disappeared into the Arctic in 1845. This group of 2 ships and 129 men were trying to find their Northwest Passage, and it became a great quest in the late 1800s to figure out what happened to them. So Swatka basically hired 2 Inuit families to guide him from the western shores of Hudson Bay across the northern part of Canada to the Arctic Ocean, looking for the fate of this expedition. And in the process, he traveled 3,000 miles across the Arctic on foot and by dog sled. They started out with 1 month's food supply, and they were gone for 13 months, which means they were living off the land for 12 months. And I discovered the diary that he had written and was published and then essentially lost. I discovered it when I was writing my PhD dissertation back in 1980. And at that time, I had just completed a project with bicycle racers in which I pointed out that if you feed an athlete a very low carbohydrate, high fat diet, and you test their physical performance, It goes down at the end of the first week, but over the course of the next 3 weeks, it comes back up, and they essentially come back to normal. And I invented the term keto adaptation from that experience. And then I discovered that I'd been beaten by 100 years by this guy, who pointed out in his diary that when first thrown wholly upon the diet of reindeer meat, which is caribou, one is ill-disposed to exertive journeys. But this soon passes away in the course of 2 to 3 weeks. And I felt necessary to put this in my dissertation, and yet my committee let me pass, even though I hadn't discovered anything original. It had already been discovered a century before. However, this gentleman did not write down the composition of the food he was eating. He just pointed out a number of things about the types of food they ate. But again, we didn't know if it was high protein, high fat, what the proportions were. Luckily, this gentleman, a Harvard-trained anthropologist named Stefansson, Wilhelm Stefansson, for whatever reason chose to live among the Inuit people in the Arctic for about a decade. He learned their language, he wore their clothing, he used their means of travel, dog sled, to explore parts of the Arctic that no European had been to, and then came back, unfortunately in 1917, when he came back to, quote, civilization. Biochemistry and the incipient field of nutrition was just discovering the vitamins. The first vitamin was discovered, thiamine was characterized in Funk's lab in 1914. And he came back and he said, oh, gee, you have all these vitamins that are in vegetables, but they're not really necessary because I could live for up to 2 years without eating any vegetable matter and I never got sick. Of course, he was considered a quack and a fraud, both in the professional literature and the lay literature. And in order to salvage his reputation, he allowed himself to be locked up in Bellevue Hospital in New York City, along with one of his other explorer colleagues, as experimental subjects. And the purpose of the experiment was to prove that he would get sick if he just ate meat and fat. Now, human subjects committees, the result of the Declaration of Helsinki in 1975 that said you have to, research has to be done ethically. You could never do that research today. But back in 1928, when this was done, the purpose was to see if he got scurvy and actually prove that he would get scurvy. So Stefansson and the other gentleman, Anderson, lived in constant observation for 6 months. Well, Stefansson for 4 and Anderson for 6, and then followed this diet for a full year, consisting of just animal products. It was what we would now call a pure carnivore diet. And in this case, Walter McClone and Eugene Dubois, and Gary mentioned Eugene Dubois was one of the fathers of modern metabolism in the United States, published the results of their data, of this research in 1930. And what Stefansson ate was about 115 grams of protein per day, which represented about 15 to 20% of his caloric intake. And virtually all the rest of his caloric intake came from fat. The only carbohydrate in his diet was actually the glycogen that was in the meat of the animals when they were slaughtered. So this was essentially a pure carnivore diet. They followed it continuously for a year, and they did not get sick. And these results were published in the Journal of Biological Chemistry, then as now one of the most reputable basic medical science journals in existence. And it was languished there in obscurity, and I think I may have resuscitated that when I wrote my dissertation research and published it in 1983. So where this takes us is that with that mix of very moderate protein, not high protein, very little, if any, carbs, and mostly fat in the diet, one goes into a state where the body makes ketones and circulates them in the blood at a level at which they meet much of the energy needs that was previously supported by glucose. And so this led to the concept that ketones are an alternative fuel for glucose. And we defined the level of ketones where this begins to happen at about 0.5 millimolar, so that would be right here at the edge of the green. And these levels extend depending on the degree of carbohydrate restriction, the degree of your insulin sensitivity, and also the degree of exercise, because endurance exercise does stimulate ketone production by the body, that the range for nutritional ketosis is between about 0.5 and 3 millimolar. Whereas ketoacidosis is in the range of 10 up to 20 or more millimolar. So you can see that the difference between nutritional ketosis and ketoacidosis is about a 10-fold difference. This is not subtle. It's not like you cross this line and boom, you're in ketoacidosis. There is a big separation between those two. But I'll also point out that if you had a bagel and orange juice for breakfast, your ketone level would typically be about 0.1 millimolar. So the difference between 0.1 and 1, again, is about a 10-fold difference. So this is a broad range, and that area in the middle, nutritional ketosis, has been demonstrated over and over again to be physiologically safe, and I want to convince you that perhaps it's physiologically beneficial. So putting this on a picture of in the context of the full range of diets that has been published and for which claims for human health have been made, nutritional ketosis occurs at a very modest protein level in the range of 10 to 20% of daily energy expenditure. By the way, this is not intake, and I'll explain why that's important in the next slide. But 10 to 20% of your daily energy need coming from protein, typically less than 10% coming from carbohydrate, and that's where you achieve nutritional ketosis. And yet, the common use of the term low carbohydrate diet typically refers to diets that are less than 30% of energy as carb, and including the paleo diet. And Lauren Cordain from Colorado State, who is one of the early scientific promoters of the term paleo, defined the diet typically as 30% protein and 20% carbs and about 50% fat. And there's really metabolically a dramatic difference between these, and that this is the range in which nutritional ketosis occurs, and it does not occur in this range here for almost anybody who practices a traditional paleo diet. They're different, they have different benefits, and different people with different levels of insulin sensitivity may or may not benefit from one versus the other, but they're not the same. And so lumping all things together as low carbohydrate, I think, is really, you're losing the baby in a larger kettle of bathwater. So what does this look like with real food? And I will tell you, I am a very strong proponent of establishing and maintaining nutritional ketosis with real food. There are supplements and other things out there. We can discuss their potential use, but I consider them marginal. So a well-formulated ketogenic diet is one that provides the protein in the range of 15 to 20% from a broad range of fat-rich foods. If you look at a food and it says low fat and you think, can I include that in a ketogenic diet? Well, if it's low fat, then you have to find the fat you need someplace else and add it too. So you can add fat in the terms of butter and high-fat cheeses, olive oil, and other naturally occurring oils. And it looks like, you look at this picture like there's a lot of protein here, but I'll point out that our definition includes 4 to 5 servings per day of non-starchy vegetables. Now, Stefansson didn't eat non-starchy vegetables, and why would I say they're important? Well, one thing is I am very concerned that with modern foods, and particularly when they've been processed or refined, that we remove much of the potassium and magnesium from those foods, either in the refining or in the cooking. And potassium and magnesium are very essential components for the long-term health and safety of a well-formulated ketogenic diet. And the place where our patients get at least half of their potassium is from the vegetables and then from berry fruits such as olive oil and berries, which are eaten in very limited quantities as part of this diet. So you can see there's a broad range of foods here, and this does not have to contain meat. You can do this as a pescatarian diet. You can do it as a lacto-ovo vegetarian diet. And we have some of our patients who do this as pure vegans and succeed at it. But the pure vegan version of this becomes very, very difficult to do because one has to use isolated vegetable proteins in order to get adequate protein without too much carbs. But it is possible to do. Now, one of the questions I get asked over and over is, well, don't tell me about grams of protein and grams of carbs. Just what are the macros? And what I want to point out is when a person who is overweight starts on a well-formulated ketogenic diet, virtually every time they do that, every individual, when they eat to satiety, keeping protein moderate and carbohydrates very limited, and eating fat to satiety, they typically undereat their caloric intake by something approaching 1,000 calories a day. So if this was a a 5'6" woman weighing 180 pounds. And eating to satiety, if she ate 90 grams of protein and 30 grams of carbohydrate, which is this many calories, and ate that much fat, body fat is contributing the rest of the calories that that person burns. But over the course of many months, as that person loses weight, typically their perceived need for energy goes up. Their, quote, appetite goes up. And as their appetite goes up, if we hold carbohydrates and protein constant, then they eat more fat. And then as they slowly work their way to the point where they reach a new steady state at a reduced weight, in order to stay stable and remain in nutritional ketosis, they might be able to eat a little bit more carbs. They don't need any more protein. So they basically advance their fat intake in order to achieve and maintain satiety and weight stability. And this is so the macros, the percent of calories on your plate of each of those nutrients changes as you go through these phases. So the way we practice this is we prescribe protein, we prescribe specific individualized carbohydrate restriction, and tell people to eat fat to satiety. The other thing that's changed with ketones just in the last 6 or 7 years is that there is a whole new science of understanding beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is the primary ketone we make and circulate in our bloodstream. We've come to understand that beta-hydroxybutyrate is not just an alternative fuel. And as some nutrition textbooks still say, it's definitely not a toxic byproduct of fat metabolism. Beta-hydroxybutyrate turns out to be a very potent epigenetic signal. It is also a very effective fuel source for both the brain and the heart. And for the brain and the heart, it appears to be superior as an energy source because it produces less reactive oxygen species, sometimes called free radicals, and it uses less oxygen to release a calorie full of ATP, of energy. So it's a more efficient fuel for certain organs in the body, particularly the brain and the heart. So the liver takes fat, makes it into ketones, and that turns into an optimum fuel for critical organ systems in the body. And we also now know that because of its epigenetic signaling, that beta-hydroxybutyrate made in the liver circulates through the blood, alters the gene expression in other tissues in the body that enhances a number of very beneficial effects, which includes altering the body's response to, metabolically response to the calories that are burned, and we make less reactive oxygen species. So we have less damaging free radicals, and we also turn on the body's defenses against those free radicals. In other words, we have antioxidant production capacity in the body that is put to sleep when we eat carbohydrates, and when we reduce our carbohydrate intake level to the points that we make get above a certain modest threshold of ketones, that antioxidant system is turned on. And that may be why Stefansson was able to live in Bellevue Hospital for a year and not get scurvy, because vitamin C is an antioxidant. If you eat carbs, you need to eat antioxidants, such as vitamin C and vitamin E, to defend against free radicals. But if you enable this inborn process that we all have, it may alter the need for exogenous antioxidants. I'm not saying we shouldn't eat them. I'm just saying it may answer the paradox of why this guy was able to live for a year on meat and fat and not develop a antioxidant deficiency disease. So these are two papers that have been published, this in 2013 and this in 2014 by the folks who were at UCS, University of California, San Francisco, John Newman and Eric Verdin, that have fundamentally changed our perspective of beta-hydroxybutyrate as a therapeutic molecule. It's also become apparent just in the last 6 or 7 years that underlying type 2 diabetes is a process that we loosely call inflammation. And it's now understood that one of the drivers, before we actually develop type 2 diabetes, one of the drivers for that process occurring in the body is inflammation, something we call inflammation. So this slide is a hypothesis. I'm going to talk about this tomorrow, and where my talk is going to focus on inflammation. But I'll just point out that when you eat a ketone-suppressing diet, that is a diet with enough carbohydrates that keeps your ketones very low, you have an increased production of reactive oxygen species, and that can drive damage to membranes that we now can link to the actual pathophysiology of insulin resistance and aging. When you eat a ketogenic diet, you make less reactive oxygen species, your membranes are healthier, and then I'll talk about this other suppressing another pro-inflammatory process as well. So there's a very basic biochemistry involved here that's very complex. And anybody who says, oh, it's just simple, don't believe them. Ask, as Gary says, ask for your money back. This is not simple. This is very complex. And as a scientist, I find it very elegant. So quickly, I want to go through a couple examples of how this works in real human beings. Jeff Volek and I decided to do a project back 10 years ago where we recruited 40 people with metabolic syndrome, aka pre-diabetes, and we randomized them to 2 dietary interventions. One of them was we gave them a low-fat diet, which was relatively high in carbohydrates, and we wanted them to lose weight, so we prescribed it at about 1,500 calories per day. The other group was randomized to a low-carbohydrate ketogenic diet, and you can see that this isn't 70% fat, this is 60% fat, because this is in the early phase of, we initiated the diet in people who were overweight, and we knew they were going to undereat. So this diet was eaten to satiety, this was prescribed restriction. Both ended up being about 1,500 to 1,600 calories per day. They followed this diet for 3 months with close monitoring and close support. And as we typically see, both groups lost weight, but the group on the ketogenic diet lost about twice as much weight as the group on the high carbohydrate diet. And these are the individual weight losses, and you can see that the highest weight loss on the high carbohydrate energy restricted diet was actually less than the average for this other group, and many of these people lost more weight. And people will typically say, well, this is because you lose a lot of water on the ketogenic diet. But using DEXA analysis of body composition, only 1 kilogram of this 5 kilogram difference was due to extra body water. These people lost more body fat. And that comes to the fundamental question that Gary was putting up here is there something going on beyond strictly just calories in and calories out? And I can't address that, and we continue to discuss this. But my point is that when these people with metabolic syndrome followed the low-fat, with low-fat diet, they had some improvements in their metabolic syndrome, which are the parameters outlined in green here. And so it's abdominal fat, visceral fat here, triglycerides, good or HDL cholesterol, and blood glucose control. But the people who followed the high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, eating to satiety, had dramatically better responses to this. And they had markedly improved insulin sensitivity, which we think may be due to the epigenetic signaling of the ketogenic diet. And so you have 2 diets that look similar in terms of what people say they're eating. And again, this is an outpatient study, so we don't know precisely. But we got dramatically better results with the ketogenic diet. Now, this is metabolic syndrome, and the question is, what happens if you do that for people who have type 2 diabetes? And that was basically the question that we addressed when we started Virta. And our first task as a company was to actually do a very rigorous test of our hypothesis that this could be safe and effective in people with type 2 diabetes. And so, and other speakers will talk about managing diabetes. I just want to say that we recruited 262 people with type 2 diabetes. We gave them this type of diet, eaten to satiety. But this can't be done safely if someone's on insulin, sulfonylureas, and other meds because their blood sugar will respond very quickly. So we did this in the in the context of remote continuous care, where we were on a daily basis monitoring their blood sugars and their ketones. We had our coach and physician in the loop, and they had a community support to get over the hostile pushback they got from people. This is what happened to hemoglobin A1C. So they dropped from 7.6, and over the course of 2 years maintained a 1 percentage point decrease in hemoglobin A1C. We had a usual care control group, and they trended upwards over time. And this is what happened to their body weight. And again, this is eating to satiety from day one. This is not a calorically restricted diet. We do see a slight uptick at 2 years, but this is dramatically better than any published data in a type 2 diabetes cohort. And if time allows, I want to take the last minute or two to mention a paper that Jeff Volek and his group was allowing me to participate to address the question of, well, if people lose weight, they get better. It really doesn't matter which diet they're on. If they lose weight, the more weight you lose, the better your diabetes, your metabolic syndrome will improve. So this study involved recruiting 16 people with metabolic syndrome. And in this case, we did something very perverse, very mean, because these are all overweight people. But we fed them a weight maintenance diet for 3 months. But the diet consisted of 3 separate phases. One phase was a low fat, high carbohydrate diet. One phase was an intermediate, moderate carbohydrate diet, and one phase was a low carbohydrate diet. But these were in random order, and everybody did all 3 arms. So it was a randomized crossover weight maintaining diet, and only one of these was ketogenic and one was moderate in carb. So this shows the nutrient content. The low carb was 6 grams of carbs. The intermediate was 6%. This was 32%, and this was 57%. And so they held their weight constant across all 3 arms. Their food was all their food was cooked for them and provided to them. And we had excellent adherence. No one dropped out of the study because we were giving them free food. And when we looked at metabolic syndrome, everybody who entered the study qualified for metabolic syndrome. If they ate the high carbohydrate diet, didn't matter which order, only 1 out of the 16 reversed their metabolic syndrome on a high carbohydrate weight maintenance diet. When we fed the moderate carbohydrate diet, 3 out of 16 reversed their metabolic syndrome. And we fed them the low carbohydrate ketogenic diet, 9 out of 16, more than half of them in just 1 month reversed their metabolic syndrome without weight loss. So what this states very clearly, it's not about weight loss. The most powerful tool we have is carb restriction. And if we get the carb restriction down to the level of nutritional ketosis, we can actually reverse prediabetes on individuals independent of weight loss. And I had a lot more detail here, but I'm way over time, so I'll just, I think Ivor Cummings is going to talk about lipoproteins in this situation. We always got the question, what about saturated fat? The people on the high carbohydrate diet were eating the least amount of saturated fat. No, can't go back. The people on the high carbohydrate were eating the least amount of saturated fat, but they had the actual increase in saturated fat in their blood, whereas people on the very low carbohydrate diet who were eating the most saturated fat had the greatest decrease in saturated fat. And that's because on the low carbohydrate diet, they weren't making saturated fat, and on the low carbohydrate diet, they were burning fat, and particularly saturated fat, at a very high rate. Anyway, that's so. Let me just state my conclusions I think are fairly obvious, and that is that nutritional ketosis in outpatients is very difficult to do, but it is possible to do that when you give people adequate support. And I do want to point out that for people with either severe hypertension or type 2 diabetes on medication, in order for this to be done safely, it has to be closely monitored by a physician who's expert in the management of this process, because we have to withdraw these dangerous medications very promptly as they adhere to the diet. And that's it. Thank you.